This is not political. This is how the government does it under all. And there is a reconciliation, but the reconciliation happens once a year. It happens once a year, and we won't see those changes until next spring. And the word that's coming from the government right now, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this is not an Obama or Romney issue. This is just a question of what the methodologies are. Again, I'm not taking any sides here. The advance indications that we're hearing is that the job numbers, which come from payroll records, have been undercounting jobs. That's the suspicion. What it really turns out to be is a different story. And of course, what we also don't know in these numbers is, are we adding and recovering the same level of jobs that we lost? Or are people coming back at a different pay level? Are we, we've lost a lot of time, so I know you have a lot of questions, and we'll try to get to them at the end, but I think we're just going to need to kind of push through here because we're already well behind schedule. But that's the argument. That's the controversy and where it's coming from. No matter how you look at it, though, the numbers have been a bit weak and very inconsistent. Here's where we really get to understand how this recession is playing out. Every line, I love talking to appraisers because we're so analytical. Every line there corresponds to one of the prior recessions. And the way the chart is working is this point over here on the left at 0% on month 0 represents the starting point of every recession since World War II. And then what we're tracking on each of those lines is the job losses coming down, followed by the job recovery coming up. And if you look at this red line, it is exactly the same line as we looked at back here. It's this line again, but we're doing it instead of in bar form, in line form. And so this recovery that we're looking at here, this recession, you can see the loss of the 8.7 million jobs coming down to the bottom, which occurred over a time period, the job losses of 24 months. Then you can see as we started to add jobs coming back up. Incidentally, this little corrective line here is taking out the temporary census jobs that were created, which was really an artificial increase in jobs because we added them and then we lost them when that temporary employment period ended. And you can see that now we're not yet halfway back up to the top. We're not yet halfway back up to the top. And we're 57 months into this recession. Let's think of it in terms of 5 years. So if we were to just do a straight line extrapolation that said we're halfway back in 5 years, that would suggest that it's going to take 10 years to get all the way back. Now, the math is not that simple, but I'm just giving you an example of what the logic is. If you look at all these prior lines, on average, prior recessions, and we heard about this in the debate on Tuesday night talking about the Reagan recovery. In prior recessions, the average time it took to recover all the jobs that were lost was 18 months on average in all prior recessions. 18 months full recovery. Here, 57 months half recovery. Extraordinary times? Yes. Yes. A pretty horrific starting point. Disappointing recovery? Yes. Both sides have an argument. And we're going to come back to this slide later, and we're going to see just another view on that a little bit later. So we heard last night about some of the recessions that occurred. For example, the 1980 recession. The 1980 recession, which was the year that Ronald Reagan was elected, recovered all of its jobs in 1980 within 10 months. The 1981 recession, which was another recession that followed, took about 24 months. So this one's taking extraordinarily long. Personal income. This is the most powerful indicator for what happens next in housing, and for the first time, household income is rising. That's a good indication because one of the obstacles to home purchase demand going forward, and again, without a housing market that's recovering, we cannot have a durable economic recovery. We need to have it in there. It's a vital component. What we see here is that housing, personal income is starting to rise on a national level and here in New Jersey as well, incidentally. And that's going to create additional housing demand going forward. I remember when I bought my first house in 1976, I immediately called my dad, which I did every time I had a major decision to make. And I said, Dad, I'm a little nervous about this mortgage payment. Principal, interest, taxes, and insurance are going to cost me $325 a month. And my rent is only $250 a month, and I'm sweating those $65 a month. He said, as long as your income is going to go higher, no problem. Because maybe you stretch a little bit for a year or so, and then when your income goes higher, you're going to look back and say, I'm so happy I made that decision. And so that's what's happening here. And when we look at the rate of rise of personal income growth in the United States, it accelerated sharply this year. Last year, we were seeing 0.3% income growth per quarter. That number is was about 6 times that in the first quarter. But then again, income growth is slowing in the second quarter because the economy is slowing. And so we're sort of in this stop-and-go economy and don't seem to be able to get out of the rut. Okay, with all that as background, now let's take a look at the real estate sectors. We're going to look at housing. We're going to single-family housing, multifamily housing. We're going to look at the office markets, retail markets, and what's happening in warehouse and how this is all playing out. I'm going to pick up the pace here because we've got a lot to cover. We are in the midst of a housing recovery, and in all likelihood, this recovery gets traction, continues, is durable, and accelerates as we get into next year and the year beyond. There are some wild cards out there that have the ability to cut this housing recovery off at the legs, but they are just that. They are wild cards. Absent these wild cards, and we'll talk about them later, and one of the wild cards would be what happens if Republicans and Democrats can't agree on some extension of the Bush tax cuts, and everybody's payroll taxes, on average, the average worker sees an increase of $6,000 a year in taxes next year, because that's what we'd be looking at on January the 1st if they can't come to some agreement. I can tell you that's going to have an effect on housing demand. That's a wild card. What happens if that Israeli and Iranian conflict turns into a war and the flow of oil is stopped coming out of the Persian Gulf? I can tell you our economy is going to slow and the housing recovery will get chopped off at the legs. So there's wild cards out there that we'll talk about later. But absent those possibilities becoming realities, absent that, this recovery keeps going, and it's very, very strong right now in terms of the pace of recovery. There's a lot of reasons for it. We're going to go through them very quickly. A series of drivers here ranging from housing home purchase affordability, which is at all-time record highs, some economic recovery, which is creating more optimism amongst consumers. Let's take a look at it. First, house prices in the U.S. have reset to 2003 levels. That's a big adjustment. House prices on average have fallen about 30%. It's all over the board in terms of what they really did. Here in this state of New Jersey, home prices fell 27% from the peak. 30% was the national number. And essentially, you can go out and buy a house today for what it would have cost you 9 years ago. There are very few things that you can buy that you can say that about, and that creates purchasing power and housing affordability. Secondly, interest rates today are ridiculously low. Low threes, 3.3, 3.4, 3.2%, 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. What an extraordinary opportunity. Now, of course, it doesn't help you if you don't have money saved for down payment and closing, if you don't have a 700-plus credit score, and if you don't have verifiable income. But if you fit that category, great opportunity to buy. And in all likelihood, we will be looking early next year, just in time for the spring market, at interest rates of 2.x. Why? Because the Federal Reserve has now embarked on quantitative easing 3, QE3. It's not the Queen Elizabeth. It's not an ocean liner. It's the Federal Reserve's manipulation of the money markets to try to drive down interest rates. It's QE3 because it's the third time they're doing it. The first 2 times they did it, we saw interest rates work their way from 6.5% down to 4.5% and 4%. This is the third time they're at it, and we can expect that interest rates are going to go a little bit lower. We have a shot at 2.9 interest rate on the first of the year. That could happen here. It's not a certainty, but that's the game plan. And this time the Fed said, we're not putting a limit on how much we're going to spend in doing this, which they did have a limit on dollars the first 2 times, and we're not putting a time limit on it, which they did the first 2 times. They said, we're going to keep doing it until interest rates go lower and the economy doesn't need us to do it anymore, we're probably looking at 2.9% interest rates, fixed rate, 30-year, non-jumbo, first of the year. When you put together a 30% drop in home prices and interest rates, which are artificially low at all-time record highs, you end up with home purchase affordability, which is at record highs. On a national level, you can afford today 50% more house than your income would normally entitle you to. Or you could buy the same house and your housing payments will be 50% less than they would typically be in relation to your income, because of ridiculously low prices and ridiculously low interest rates. And by the way, this is the first time in history that that's ever occurred. Never before have we had falling interest rates and falling house prices. It normally goes the other way, doesn't it? Interest rate goes down, purchase demand goes up. We had both, which is a tremendous opportunity. That's why buyers are coming back into the market. Add into that the decline in home ownership rate, first it went from 64 to 69, now it's gone from 69 back to 65, right? It's corrected. That drop has put more renters into the market in an undersupplied rental market because we haven't been building rental properties for the last couple of decades. As a result, rents are rising 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% a year depending upon the market. And that favorably affects home ownership, because there's a very favorable rent versus own calculation today. And every major economist, every major analytic firm has come to the conclusion that if you have down payment, income, and good credit, it's cheaper to buy than rent because of interest rates and prices being where they are.